Well, I don't have any great jokes for you this morning. I rejected all my joke possibilities, except this little one, which it's kind of a kids level joke, but I think it's fun. Did you hear about the snail that got mugged by a couple of turtles? Yeah. Called the police. Police asked the snail what happened. He said, I don't know, it all happened so fast. All relative. Well, and in a way that leads into the talk, because I want to talk a little bit about how we get through the difficult times, the dark times. I've been kind of pursuing a lot of approaches to that, kind of a series lately on dealing with dark times, troubled times, uncertain times, and what spiritual teachings we can turn to in times like that to empower us and strengthen us and guide us. And so I was looking again at some of the old Bible stories for what they taught. Some of these ancient stories were really intended for us to get some meaning, some guidance on how to live our own lives. I learned a word years ago. It was at a presentation by Bishop John Shelby Spong. Any of you ever read any Spong? Or he was in Columbus some years back and did a presentation down at a church near the campus area. And I learned this word midrash. It was a new word for me. It's a Hebrew word that really means, these old stories were meant to be, it means to inquire into the hidden meaning of these teachings. And all these old Bible stories that's what they were intended. They weren't intended to be literal accounts of things that happened or historical accounts in some way. They were meant to be stories that we're to dig for the hidden meaning in and interpret for us to use in our lives. So I was remembering some of those old stories, and what did they teach us about how to deal with challenges and tough times and injustice and darkness. So how many of you remember, this is one of my favorite kids' Bible stories, the story of the fiery furnace? All right, one of my favorites, the trio Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they were doing very well until all of a sudden King Nebuchadnezzar, who apparently was just sort of a power-hungry control freak, decided to make everybody bow down to his god. And he erected a gold statue, and everyone was supposed to, at the sound of the music or lyres or trumpets or whatever, they were all supposed to bow down to this god that Nebuchadnezzar said they should worship. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego wouldn't do so. And so they were dragged in before the king. He was very angry. But they do not waver. They say, if our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up. They stick with God. They stick with God. So they're thrown in the fiery furnace. I remember in that kids' Bible I had as a child, I loved the images of them in their robes deep in the fiery furnace. And the fire was so hot, apparently, that the guards who threw the three men in were burned to death, just throwing them in there. But immediately after, the king looks in, and he says, I see 4 men. Weren't there 3? I see 4 men unbound, walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the 4th has the appearance of a god. So he orders them to be brought out, and they're unharmed. Scripture said the fire had no power over them. Not a hair was singed. Not even the smell of fire came from them. The king was so astonished, he released them and became interested in their God, learning all about this God that they worshipped, and they were promoted in the kingdom. So there was the appearance of a God with them. They were with God in the fiery furnace. Great images, pictures in my children's Bible when I was a kid of them walking around unconcerned in the middle of the fire in their colorful robes and a divine being with them. They were with God. This is a teaching story. This is Midrash. This is a teaching story for us about how do we deal with injustice, with bad things that happen, with dark times. They stuck with God. We get with God and we stick with God. And we're unwavering about that. It seems to me that's a core teaching of this story. And as I started thinking about some of the other Old Testament stories, that same teaching comes out again and again. How do we deal with troubled times? get with God. Get with God. Noah survived the deluge. Waters covering the earth because he stuck with God no matter what. I grew up on Bill Cosby doing comedy routines about Noah's Ark. Any of you remember that? 10 cubits, 12 cubits, whatever, building the ark, neighbors making fun of him. But the adage was true. Scripture says Noah walked with God. Noah walked with God, and that's what saved him and his family and life on earth. Getting with God and sticking with God, no matter what. Following, Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. Moses did what God commanded him, and God guided Moses and the children of Israel through wandering through the wilderness till they found that land of milk and honey. That seems to me a real primary teaching of all these old teaching stories. We get with God. And we know that means we don't go anywhere else. It's right here. It's right now. But we don't always feel that we're with God, right? The obstruction can be in us. There are times when we feel more connected than others. How do we do that? How do we get with God then? It doesn't mean we go anywhere or do anything particular. It's a matter of awareness, deepening our awareness of God right here and now. So how do we do that? If that core truth is true in all situations, in all kinds of confusion, chaos, uncertainty, fear, worry, that the answer is to get with God, get closer to God, and stick with God so we can hear the guidance we need and have the sense of that power with us that we need. How do we do that? Anything that makes us feel in greater touch with God is what we need to turn to. We cultivate our relationship with God, and we learn through practice what works for us. And each of us, it might be a little different. Different techniques we learn, different ways of feeling in closer touch with God's power and presence, and having closer access to that flow of that guidance that can come to us. There's so many ways to nourish that God connection and to claim that guidance. But I thought, here's a few basics, kind of the basic things, and see if these work for you, how we nourish our God connection. Here's one that comes to mind. I see it again and again in those I know, and in my own life. Find the one thing that calms your mind. That's step one. For each of us, there's one thing that calms us and steadies our minds. We can't get with God if our minds are in an uproar. And in troubled times, our thoughts are often more agitated than ever. Emotions running higher. Thoughts more scattered and full of dread or anxiety. So it's difficult to feel that God connection, to get with God and stick with God and be in the flow of that God guidance and direction when our minds are full of that, when our minds are chaotic and confused. So many of the people I know have this one thing that calms their mind so they can get in closer touch with God again and get the flow of that guidance going again. I think everybody has one thing, and I bet if we did a survey in here, everyone would be able to come up with something. It changes over the course of our lives quite often. That one thing might change from one decade to the next, and there's quite a variety among us of what those are. Often they're physical or manual things. But there are also detailed, task-oriented kinds of things that have clear goals that you can accomplish. Not big, mushy problems that we'll never figure our way out of, but tasks with steps and processes that we can get through and to accomplish certain goals. There's a psychologist whose name I cannot pronounce. He's noted for his books on flow. His most recent one was called Finding Flow. I could try this name, but I won't succeed. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Good, yeah. I don't know, Polish name maybe? I can't get it, but look up Flow, Google Flow, and you'll find he's got various books on it. He called this the key to happiness, the psychological state he calls flow. And it's being absorbed in a task. And it could be chess, or it could be bowling, or it could be cooking, or it could be gardening. It could be any number of things. That it has clear goals and tasks, goals that you can accomplish. And as you're absorbed in that task, it refreshes the mind, it calms the mind, and you have this greater sense of contentment and ease. You are in flow. That's a state he calls flow. That helped me a lot to hear about that, because I think that's true. He says very rarely do people have that feeling of flow like watching TV or something like that. But often, more often than people would realize, at work. It depends on if you're working on something with specific things, tasks to accomplish, goals that you can meet, and the time flies. You're kind of in flow. I think we've all had that experience, haven't we? We all need, and I think that's why this one thing, we all have one thing in our lives that helps us calm our minds so that we can get in closer touch with God. I remember being saved by that as an adolescent, a first significant depression I had in my life as a teen. Very depressed, and my mother put me, she consulted with her minister in Cincinnati, who she stayed in touch with down through the years, and he said, get her doing something with her hands. Get her doing something with her hands. And so we went to the local sewing store, and I picked out an embroidery pattern, and all these colorful threads and needles, and the charts on how to do French knots, and all these little stitches. So very detailed stitches, patterns, instructions, threads, a pattern to follow, and I started doing that in any spare moment, and it was a tremendous relief to my mind. I felt like I was stitching my sanity back together, just from the rote of doing this task. How many of you do things with your hands? It's real refreshing. It calms the mind. I know I have friends who sew. There's something about specific tasks that your mind is absorbed in, and it keeps our minds from going off in a million directions. Something very refreshing about that. A lot of people get it from physical workouts of some kind. My brother used to say that all his best ideas came to him while running. He did a lot of running, did marathons, things like that. Because you're just focused on one step in front of the other, and you're on your breath. You're right here. Your mind isn't spinning out in 100 different directions. I had a minister friend for a number of years. Some of you might remember Reverend Wayne Manning. I know many of you do, over at Unity of Columbus. And he was a pilot. He had a plane. He kept at the OSU airport. I had the opportunity to go up with him once on a flight. I think we went from Columbus to Mansfield and back. And I was sort of struck, never having been in a private plane before, all the details. Flying is very technical. All the many details of the pre-takeoff checks inside, as well as all around the outside of the plane. The pilot goes through all these detailed instructions on checks for things. It's very physical. But it's also very mental. It's very manual. There's really no time or space for worries. And I think that's why he said, I asked him why he enjoyed flying. He said it clears away the cobwebs in his mind. It was this one thing. It was this one thing that helped him keep his mind calm and steady. Another friend, Dan, spends time in his shop every day. He has a shop behind the house, part of the garage, and where he makes and builds things. And he's been doing this his whole life. This has been one thing that he's had most of his life, probably starting as a teenager. He builds cabinetry, and kitchen gadgets, and jewelry, and cars. I think he can build anything. He goes to these car swap meets. I forgot what you call them exactly. And more than 20 years ago, he got just a chassis, I think they call it, a frame for a Model A car. And over a period of 20 years, he kept getting more parts, and he built the whole car. Built a Model A car. His home is full of things he's custom built. It's his one thing. It's his one thing. There's time for that. And it's probably going around in his head sometimes, too, when he's not in the shop. Things like this can be very calming of the mind, to have something like that. Building something, creating something, specific tasks that you can do and accomplish can be tremendously refreshing in a time and in a world where there are so many things we can't fix. So many things that can be a little overwhelming. There's so much to worry about if we let ourselves, and so we can't let ourselves. And it clears the mind if we can think of something we can do step by step, right here, right now. Think of Noah tinkering away at his ark, measuring and nailing and putting the boards together. Must have been centering. Must have helped keep him in touch with God's guidance. So that to me seems a big first one, is if we can find that one thing. And it'll vary throughout our lives. Yoga's a big one for me now. What is it for you? What helps you calms your mind and enables you to stay closer to that God power and presence, because your mind isn't veering off in a million directions. Second one is, and this is kind of the next step, if you can control the chaos of the mind, then keep your mind off the lack and on the supply. Keep your mind off the devastation and on creation. Our favorite spiritual teachers in Unity, so many of them, Charles Fillmore, Ernest Holmes, Emily Cady, Emmett Fox, all reiterated that point again and again. Turn away from the problem. Turn away from the negativity. Turn away from the dread. Turn away from everything that's wrong and how can it ever be fixed. Turn your mind away from that and put it on your vision of the good. Put it on the supply. Put it on the power that's at play. Put it on the creative energy that's at work. Shift your mind away from the lack and move it to the supply. Jesus taught that as well. Turn from the darkness and affirm the light. Get with God. It's the same teaching. In Mark 11, when you pray, believe that you have received what you pray for, and it will be yours. That's a powerful teaching on prayer. And too often, we don't pray that way. Would you agree? Too often, we pray more with a kind of a focused dread on what I don't have. I have prayed that way. Have any of you? When my total focus is on deepening my misery, because my focus is all on what I don't have and how miserable I am without it. That has not been an empowering prayer for me. It's a familiar prayer, it's a human prayer, and we all pray it sometimes. But a more empowering prayer, a prayer that's much more effective to really shift and change things, is a prayer that's focusing on the tremendous power that's at work within and all around me. A power that has guided me through tough times in the past and is present with me now. A powerful creative energy that flows through me and everyone around me and all the circumstances and all throughout our world and in nature. It's always renewing and creating new life. The more I can shift my mind away from the dread and the misery toward power and presence, the more I'm in touch with God and the more becomes possible, because I'm in touch with the flow of that creative mind, that creative energy. There's a wonderful writer on the use of the imagination called Neville. I don't know if any of you have ever read any Neville. He says, an act of imagination, contains within itself the power of its own fulfillment. Where you are in your imagination, there you will be in the flesh. There's a power in our vivid imaginations of the good. Visioning that, seeing that in detail, instead of our misery in detail and our lack in detail, which we seem to have it seems to be easy for us. But what about envisioning the new life we want, the new world? So, to get with God, first we try to calm our minds. We find that one thing, and we make that a part of our life, our routine, to keep us calm, to keep us open to God's guidance. We turn our minds, we direct our minds away from the lack, toward the supply, away from the devastation, toward the creation, as much as we can. And then the third one is this one. We participate in creative process. We participate in creative process. We are empowered by finding something we can do to be a force for good, to participate in the creation. There's a State Farm insurance commercial going on right now that's reaching a lot of acclaim, and this is its message. You can lift the weight of caring by doing. It's such a powerful message. I can't believe it's in a State Farm insurance commercial, but there it is. So images of a man being overwhelmed by the sense of all the problems in the world. And then they're following him around. He can't get it off his mind, and then at the end he decides to volunteer somewhere, to do one thing, do something he can do. And that's the message of the whole little video clip. You can lift the weight, that sense of the overwhelming things, problems that we can have sometimes. You can be so overwhelmed we don't think there's anything we can do. What can we do? But somehow when we find something we can do, it lifts a weight off us. It helps. We participate in creation in some way, in God's work, and being a force for good in the world. And there's so many ways to do it. Every one of us can find something. Made me think of again, it was when we visited Hawaii years ago. We had one of the retreat guides was a young woman named Nikki, and she grew up around there in a little village called Kalapano, which was near the retreat center where we stayed. And her whole village was destroyed in the last lava flow in the 90s. Her family's home, her friends' homes, virtually the whole village was wiped out by that lava flow, very close to the retreat center where we stay. And for years, with tourist groups coming in, like our retreat group that was there, Nikki had been, as a part of their stay there, taking groups of tourists. They could sign up if they wanted to participate. Take groups to go out to that rocky, black rock lava beach area where her village used to be, and she'd give every tourist a little palm tree to plant at kind of the edge where the rocky lava stuff was beginning to turn into sand and soil again. Because however devastating that is, and what a horrible loss that would have been, that's also the way the islands are created and expanded, is by these volcanic eruptions that expands the islands. And over decades, it breaks down, it becomes sand again, and vegetation takes root, and it becomes a lush island again over the decades. And so Nikki had, took these field trips so everyone could participate in that process. Everybody would plant their little palm tree, as we did, these tiny little coconut palm trees. And we took pictures of the eerie landscape because it was sort of mostly barren, but all these little dots of trees that people had planted under Nikki's direction. I think that lifted the weight for her to participate in creation in that way. And we were all inspired by it because we got invited to participate in that creative process too. And in 50 years, that's going to be a lush, beautiful landscape again. All those little palm trees playing a small part in making that happen. That's her thing she could do. She found something she could do to participate in creative process. There's no lack of all kinds of inspiring examples all around us, probably in this very room, of people finding something they can do to participate in creation, in being part of the force for good in our world. I was remembering again, and I don't know if I've shared this story before, but an inspiring woman by the name of Osceola McCarty in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. She grew up, she was born in like 1908, lived to about 90. And she grew up she lived with her mom, aunt, and grandmother, and she did laundry. She did washing and ironing for people. That's how she made her money for the family, and it was coins and maybe dollar bills here and there. She had to leave school at age 12 because her aunt, after a hospital stay, became bedridden, couldn't, mobility was lost, so she dropped out of school to help care for the household and did other people's laundry her whole life and saved money starting at about age 8. She put it in her baby doll buggy under the cushions. That was her place until, as a teenager, she went by the bank one day and thought, I'm going to open a checking account. And she went in and she started putting it all in there. And she never took anything out. She just saved down through the years and just let it grow, all those coins and bits and that. She was about 87, hands swollen from arthritis. She thought it was time to do something about this, and she'd had goals with that money this whole time that she didn't tell anybody about. And she went into the bank and met with one of the bankers there that was friendly and helpful to her. And she was amazed to learn that she had $280,000 that she'd saved over a lifetime of doing other people's laundry. So the banker put out 10 dimes and said she should just make that like each one is like 10% of that. You decide where you want that to go. Because this was her estate planning session. So it was like one for her church and one for a cousin. And she set aside some for her, her needs for her last few years. And then she gave $150,000 to the University of Southern Mississippi which was a couple blocks away, but which she had never visited in her whole life, to fund a scholarship for an African-American student with financial need who couldn't go to college otherwise. And and when the town residents found out about it, they tripled her gift. They contributed as well, so it became 3 times that amount. So to this day, they are giving out several full scholarships every year in a memorial of Osceola McCarty. And she got to meet the first recipient of that. I thought I'd post this picture back on it's her, the first recipient of that, a young woman named Stephanie Bullock. Kind of remarkable, and Osceola was a joyous person, and she had a wonderful work ethic. She enjoyed her work, and she was a saver, and I like to think about how that must have lifted her to know down through all those years she was going to make a difference. She was going to make a big difference for somebody, and it's turned out to be a lot of somebodies. A lot of somebodies. What a big difference that's made. Not just for those students, but for their families, and for all the people who were inspired by her gift and thought, I can do something too. What was she saying? She said, I can't do everything, but I can do something to help somebody. And what I can do, I will do. I like the energy of that, the commitment of that. We can all find something like that. Find something we can do to participate in creative process, to be a part of that force for good in the world around us, wherever we are, whatever our skills, whatever the sphere we live in, there's something we can do, and it'll lift the weight of things feeling overwhelming. It'll give us a sense of being part of the good, part of creating the good, and it's something we can do. So how do we get with God? In times of trouble, we get with God and we stick with God, no matter what. We find the one thing that calms our minds and help us to stay centered, so our minds aren't dwelling on chaos and worries. We turn our minds as much as possible away from what's wrong, what's lacking, and keep our focus on the new vision, the new life, the supply, the power that's present and active in our midst. And we find ways to participate in creation. We plant a seed, we build something, we contribute, we volunteer, we do something that gives us a feeling of being a part of the force for good in the world. As we do that, we get with God, and we become participants in creation. So that's my affirmation today, if you'd like to join me in it. I get with God, and I participate in creation. Would you join me in that?
I get with God, and I participate in creation.
Let's take that into prayer for a moment. Hold that truth inside. In all times, in all circumstances, we know we are with God, and all we need to do is turn our awareness to that truth and hold it closer and know it more deeply, that we are one with the living God. There is no separation, no division, and we are alert and receptive and ready to follow God's guidance and direction. We are ready to feel God's love uplifting us, God's peace steadying us, God's wisdom directing our minds and hearts. How grateful we are for God in us. So it is. Amen.